Okay, hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. We are live as of now. We're starting to see the participants come in from the waiting room, so we'll give everybody just a couple of minutes to get situated, and then we'll kick things off. You should be seeing my screen share now with a beautiful high-rise building here, and we've completed 1,000 SIRS. Here's what we've learned. So, Maureen, Alex, can you see that? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll give maybe just another minute or so as we still see some people coming in from the waiting room. While we're doing that, I'll just do a couple of kind of housekeeping announcements. So this meeting is being recorded. So if there's anybody that you work with or that you're familiar with that couldn't attend it today, by all means, feel free to send this out. This is for the public good. We're here to educate and inform. We'll also be glad to make available the slides from the presentation. So if anybody's out there scrambling to try to take notes and things, don't worry. You will get a second look at all this stuff. We'll send out a PDF copy of all the slides. So. Okay. All right, we're almost leveled off, I think. So last bit of housekeeping. This is a webinar format, so we cannot hear or see anybody in the audience, but we do encourage you guys to use the Q&A feature on the taskbar. So down at the bottom of your screen, as we go along, feel free to submit any questions that you have. If there's something about the material or something related that you want us to address, the plan is to allow probably, at least 10 or 15 minutes towards the end of the session today to get through those questions. So yeah, we're here for you guys, and we appreciate everyone being here. This is not for CEU credit, so if you're a licensed CAM out there, we don't need your license number. This is really just for information's sake, just for education. So with that said, let's dive into it. Okay, so Maureen, Alex, you guys want to go first? You want to do your own introductions, then I'll follow you?
Absolutely. Ladies first.
There we go.
Thank you, gentlemen. Very excited, love education, especially with, the new dynamic and everything that's going on. So my name is Maureen Reyes. I serve as the Vice President of Business and Development for AKAM. I've done many roles throughout my property management industry, close to almost 2 decades. So again, I've been on the field being a general manager regional, and I'm very happy to be here and have such great conversations with both of you and the audience. So thank you. That's me.
All right.
Everybody, I'm Alex Argento. I'm Senior Vice President of AKAM. I lead our Southeast operations. Thrilled to be here. I have going on 30 years of experience in the built environment all over the world, but specifically started my career here in South Florida right after Hurricane Andrew. So have been here all the way through. So very excited to be here tonight. This is an important topic. And Will, thanks for having us.
No, thanks. Yeah, pleasure to join you both. So I'll round things out. Yeah, my name is Will Simons. I'm with Association Reserves. I'm the president of our Florida office. I've been with the company since 2008, so just over 17 years for me now. I've worked with thousands of community associations, primarily in Florida and the Southeast USA. I oversee all of our clients, all of our staff in Florida, and have certainly been very involved in the last couple of years with all the new SIRS legislation, SIRS requirements, which is really the subject of what we're going to talk about today. So we're happy to have you guys here. Thank you. Now I want to make this a little more casual, a little bit more of a dialogue. Some of you guys out there in the audience may have heard some of our presentations before. A couple times already this spring, we've been doing some announcements about this, SIRS legislation. But I'm excited to do this with Maureen and Alex today, because this is going to be more of a joining of perspectives, right? I'm here to talk about things from the reserve study provider side of things, but absolutely want them to chime in and give their perspective from the management side. So let's kind of give everybody a bit of an overview about what we're going to talk about. So this is a general kind of outline. We'll start with just a recap of the SIRS requirements as they are now. Talk about kind of this atmosphere that we're in. Obviously, this is a turning point for a lot of associations. There's been a lot of I don't know what you guys would call it, stress, anxiety in the marketplace, about kind of adapting to these new requirements. There's new financial burdens, let's say, that the condo owners are facing, and we're certainly sensitive to that, but really want to drive home the point that this is not going away. I mean, this is a new day for community associations in Florida, specifically condos and co-ops, are going to be affected by what we're talking about today. We'll go through just kind of a high level overview about the size and scope of the Florida marketplace, right? How many properties are affected by this stuff? How many have done their SIRS? And then we're going to get into kind of the meat of the presentation at the end, which is just looking at the actual data, right? Kind of what we teased there with the title, here's what we've learned from doing 1,000 SIRS. So that's going to be more kind of our company's perspective, but absolutely, I think we'll learn a lot from Maureen and Alex about what they've seen from their client base as well. So let's begin with kind of a quote that I've always found interesting and relevant to the work that we do. So I kind of adapted this, but some of you guys may have heard this quote from Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it, kind of that willful ignorance, if you will. So I've repurposed this for my own ends here. It is difficult to get a man or a woman or a board to understand something when avoiding increases in their association budget depends on their not understanding it, right? So that's what we're trying to combat here. I think there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about what's going on in the Florida market, and obviously everybody is never keen to increase their dues. But I think when people understand the reasoning behind this and why these changes exist, hopefully that will eliminate some of that anxiety. So, all right. So again, you guys chime in, echo me or let me know what else you would layer into these things. But we'll start with just a basic overview of the SIRS requirements. And I guess I should probably qualify or define what that means first. So SIRS, SIRS, Structural Integrity Reserve Study. That's what that stands for. It's kind of a mouthful, so I'm going to just say SIRS. So this legislation first came about in the first iteration of it was in 2022, and I'm sure everybody can recall why that was. That was the year before, in 2021. We had this just horrific, tragic event, the collapse of the Champlain Tower South condominium. 98 people lost their lives. It turned into $1 billion legal claim and has just been a complete watershed moment for the community association world, not just in Florida, by the way, but nationally. I mean, there's national effects and kind of knock-on ripple effects going around the country as a result of what happened there. But what we're going to talk about is kind of the specifics of the Florida marketplace. So the SIRS requirement, first and foremost, applies to all residential condos and co-ops that are 3 or more stories in height. So if you're in an HOA, doesn't apply to you at all. If you are in a non-residential condo, so if you have a commercial office or a medical office, or trying to think of, maybe you guys have some other examples, a dock condominium situation.
Commercial.
Those are not subject to the requirement. And if you happen to be in a 1 or a 2-story building, this does not apply to you either. It does apply regardless of the property's age or location, right? So some people have kind of this confusion a little bit with something very similar, which is called a milestone inspection requirement. Those are only required for buildings once they reach a certain age, typically 30 years or older, but not the SIRS. The SIRS is required even for newer properties, and it's all across the state. It doesn't matter if you're on the beach somewhere or if you're in the center of the state in Orlando. The SIRS requirement is kind of universal throughout the state.
And glad you brought that up, Will, just for our audience, that the idea of recertification, we're not going to speak specifically about that today, but many of the items related to recertification will be included in your SIRS study. So again, it's a tangential it's a complementary concept, but again, we're not going to talk about research today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's tons of other content online that people can find, articles, webinars, presentations, all about the milestone inspections, which are also very, very important, but not exactly the SIRS that we want to talk about. So The second point there is that the deadline for completion of the SIRS has now passed. Okay, it was December 31st of last year. There's, I don't want to dig into this too much at this point, but sometime later in the presentation, we can talk about some of the new legislation that may be coming in the very near future, which one feature of that would be an extension of this deadline to 2025. But that is not official. Officially, the law of the land says that you should have had this done, what, 4 months ago. This SB 154, that Senate Bill 154, that was passed in 2023, which really was the most recent creation of the law, and it identified which components need to be included in this analysis, which we'll talk about, I think, on our next slide. The SIRS has to be done by a licensed architect, engineer, or a reserve specialist or professional reserve analyst. It has to be based on a visual inspection conducted by somebody with that skill set. So as a property manager, that does not qualify you to do it. As a board member, you can't do your own SIRS. This has to be done by a qualified third party. Okay, this is the list, right? So these are the specific things that are now considered structural integrity reserve components under the law. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory here. You know, replacing your roof, you have to reserve for that. That is considered a structural reserve component now. The second one there, structure, is a little bit more murky, right? So structure theoretically is the entire framework of the building. It's the bones of the thing that keeps it from falling down. So that could be load-bearing walls, primary structural members, but those are typically not things that you would actively plan to replace because they really can't be replaced. I mean, you would have to tear down the building and build a new one if the entire structure was compromised in some way. So usually what this means is going to be allowances for repairs. You know, for a lot of high-rise buildings, concrete restoration is the main focus here, providing money in the reserve plan for the inevitable deterioration of concrete, especially for coastal properties. So
I think
yeah.
also, Will, one thing to add to that as we've continued to get deeper into these studies and then to review and repair, when we use the term structure, I think for people, it's also really important to consider is the photo that is on the slide, the white vertical part of the building, which is opaque, where you can't see through it. It's solid.
Yeah.
That's likely stucco. Okay, everybody, that's stucco. And the stucco is on top of structure, which is buried behind, which would be masonry units, poured in place concrete, could be steel, could be all sorts of different things behind. But what we have found also is we think about funding in the work that SIRS, components possess. It's not just the word structure, it's the things that are associated with it, affiliated with, and are adjacent to as well. So again, just want to be sure that everyone understands in item B, this could be a lot of other things tied into the term structure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the kind of application of letter H here is kind of speaks to that, right? So I'll give an example of something like balcony railings or catwalk railings at a building. You've typically got, these posts that are anchored into the structural slab, right, into your balcony or your walkway deck. And those are certainly very expensive in their own right, way more than $10,000. And the logic in letter H here is that if you fail to maintain or replace these things, could they negatively affect something else on the list? So by that definition, the failure to replace your balcony railings, if they're rotting and allowing water to penetrate the structure of the concrete slab, by that definition, now the railings themselves become a SIRS component, right? So some of these are kind of logical tests that your provider has to apply, and every building is different, but that's a pretty common one that we're using. Real quickly, letter G, where it says windows and exterior doors, I wanted to qualify that. Elsewhere in the statute, it says that the SIRS requirements are only for things that the condo association or the co-op is responsible for. So the vast majority of the time, I don't know if you guys, would agree with this, but to me, it's like 99% of the time, the declaration of the property says that the unit owner is responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. And so if that's the case, the association or the co-op does not need to be including those in its SIRS plan. They would only need to include windows and doors that are in common areas, like at a lobby or, the end of a hallway or a mechanical room, something like that.
Becomes a point of discussion. Well, as you know, and we have on many properties, the idea of, well, how am I going to fix my 40-year-old building and leave 40-year-old windows, still in
Right.
the building, but I'm going to do millions of dollars of repair in and around them. I think that's an important one. Though the other thing we see in very, very tall buildings also, and sometimes even shorter buildings that are very wide, are there's a lot of public area doors and windows that access stairways, mechanical rooms, storage rooms, bike rooms, trash chutes, all sorts of other places that you want to consider. And when you start adding those costs and adding that work in to leave other parts out, again, this is just the opportunity to really use the report and the study as that roadmap of thinking about how do I look holistically at everything. So again, don't want to be overly myopic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's you mentioned, something like a 40-year-old building that's got original windows and doors. Absolutely true. Even if those belong to the unit owner, or I should say that the cost is ultimately charged to the unit owner. What we've seen a lot of the time is the building will kind of take a project management role, hire a contractor, set a specification, hire an engineer, kind of take the lead on the replacement of all of the old, non-impact windows and doors. Some owners may have already changed theirs out individually, so they don't need to pay anything, but the building may go through and say, look, everybody else who still has old windows and doors, we're going to kind of take this project over. We're going to get them all replaced. And then those owners kind of just get charged back for their portion of that cost based on their unit size. So yeah, smart thing to do, to think.
And Will,
Yeah.
to add into that, again, is strategically thinking, right? We're not just thinking a month ahead. That's why the foundation of the report helps, the management team and the board and even the resident understand, like you're thinking with the bigger picture in mind, with the best interest long term, right? And to keep your windows are gonna 40, 50, it's enough, you need to change them, right? So I think it's the strategic thinking which provides a value as well.
No doubt. Yeah. So the overall comment that I want to make on this slide is that the SIRS requirements are kind of being laid into the existing reserve requirements of Florida Statute 718 and 719. So traditionally, those statutes have already defined what a reserve component should be, or what an association must be reserving for, which is roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, and anything else over $10,000. So that was kind of where we started. So if you will, with this kind of like outer ring here of all components, the SIRS components are just a subset of existing reserve components that have already existed. But the types of things that fall under this kind of other, if you will, this non-structural types of things, like we gave some examples here. Think of, asphalt parking lots, elevators, amenity areas, other mechanical systems, right? Things like security cameras, gate operators, those types of things, seawalls. Those are still reserve components, and a proper financial plan still needs to take all of those into account. But the specific legislative requirement that we're talking about today focuses just on the SIRS things, which were on the last slide there.
I think that we'll show this as we go forward in the presentation to folks, but I think the one thing to also focus on that a lot of people have done in the last 2 years, and I think going forward, I hope we're going to get better at this sort of new normal, is thinking about those non-SIRS components, really using the report and the useful life and the opportunity to plan for big costs. When you think about a 30-story, high-rise, single tower, center core building, there's a lot of carpet in hallways, and there's a lot of wall treatment. There's a lot of baseboard. There's a lot of interior lighting. There's a lot of lobby hallways. There's a lot of things to be potentially maintained or reserved for. And again, we think that you leveraging the report to really look at those items to be very proactive from where you're going to spend your money 3, 4, 5 years down the road when you're not necessarily worried about those structural components
Yeah.
that the mandate exists for. So again, I think for everyone, this is something not to be lost sight of, and they are real costs and timelines associated with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to come back to some concepts related to that. And I have that even on this slide here. You know, we're talking about SIRS and non-SIRS, right? So to me, the term non-SIRS is just everything else outside of those 8 items that were on the list. But let's talk about some of the kind of financial requirements that came about with this legislation. So first of all, most associations, or I should say nationally, almost all associations use what's called the pooled method for reserves. In Florida, we still have some older properties that are using the straight line method, which is a different form of accounting for reserve funding, but pooled reserves are good. However, the requirement now, because we have this separate subset of SIRS items, is that although you can still use the pooled method in general, you will effectively have to have 2 pools of funds now. You can have a pool of funds that is for your structural elements, and then a separate pool of funds for your non-structural. And all of the cash within each of those pools can be spent freely on anything that's listed there, but not on the other side, right? So like the intention here is you can't use reserve money that was meant for replacing your roof and use that to remodel your lobby. Even though both of those are reserve components, from a financial standpoint now, the funding of those is going to be treated separately. The minimum amount of funding that is required hasn't changed. So the kind of the formal definition of this is something we call baseline funding. It means that as you put money into your pool, you have to demonstrate that each year, as cash goes in and cash goes out, that you will never run out of money. You will never go below 0. That's the absolute bare minimum you can do. That has effectively always been the case in Florida. That hasn't changed. So there's been some people out there that have called, very anxiously saying, do we have to come up with all of the cash for all of our components right now? No, absolutely not. All you have to do is show that you will have enough money in the bank at the time each of those components gets replaced to be able to pay for it and not go into the negative. So if anybody was out there, lately, I think most people have kind of come to terms with this, but I know initially when this requirement came out, people were thinking, do we need to make up for the last 20 years that we waived our reserves and collect all of that money right now? And the answer is no. So we're here now in 2025, and there's a couple things that are now in effect. First of all, for any budget adopted this year and beyond, the association can no longer waive reserves for those structural components. It is mandatory to fund them. You don't have the option to ignore that reality. Just for perspective, that has been the status quo everywhere else in the country for many, many, many years. It's only in Florida that the membership of an association, to my knowledge, ever had this option to vote against reserve funding. And that's largely why we're in this mess, is why so many buildings are in these kind of weak financial states, is because over the years, generation after generation of owners came along and said, well, that's going to be somebody else's problem. We're just going to waive it. We don't want to raise our budget. Well, when the music stops and you've got all these projects that are now coming due and you've been ignoring that budgeting over the years, that's when you start to find yourselves in trouble with special assessments and things like that. Last point on this slide is that it is still possible to waive reserves for the non-structural elements, but it's not as easy as it used to be. And so traditionally that was a majority of a quorum of owners that could carry that vote. Now it's 51% or whatever constitutes a majority of owners. That's how many people would have to vote to waive the reserves for the non-structural. So yeah.
And I think in just a couple things on this slide, just for folks to think about, we have a lot of associations that we work with that have had non-pooled reserves, that they were doing it on a line item by line item basis. based on some of the old statutory language, and then I think some sort of best practice stuff. So if you've been doing that and you're part of a multi-tiered association, you're a sub to a master, or you pay into something else, you're not losing money. Don't get worried. We can always go through it. You can reclass, you can pull, you can leave it where it is potentially and start, fresh, but it's not a problem. So don't worry about that. I think the other thing that we spend a lot of time talking to people about once we get through the SIRS dollars are non-SIRS reserves and what are you really funding for there. The only because you have the ability to vote to waive those reserves, this is fundamental to the health of an association. And I think what we really think about is asset value going forward, because there are some very, very, very large ticket items that are in those non-SIRS buckets that we see leading to special assessment needs, sometimes beyond the SIRS. So
Yeah.
this is something that, and you can't move that money around from a SIRS bucket to a non-SIRS bucket. So again, this is something really, really important that I will use the term a lot here, whether that's a blueprint or roadmap, that the study will really help inform your budget process over the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think elevators for me would be the first one that comes to mind there.
Yeah.
Elevator modernization is crazy expensive, to be honest. And
And
it's only
another
gotten
big
worse.
one is seawall down here.
Yeah.
Seawall, depending on it, can be a huge, huge, huge one. So there are
Right.
many.
Yeah. All right. So that was just kind of a quick recap. Again, that's what is in place now in the law. Hopefully we'll have some time to kind of speculate a little bit today about what may be coming, but assuming nothing changes, those are the requirements as they are now. So kind of wanted to talk a little bit now about this new normal. What do associations have to do? So
And
yeah,
we'll leave time for you to be able to speculate, because as we have discussed, there was some big news today. So
yeah,
we'll
yeah,
save it for the end, but
yeah.
we'll tease people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's some hot off the presses information. So you
Yeah.
glad for you guys to be here today. All right. So just real quickly, I wanted to touch on a couple things that came about last summer. So last summer we had House Bill 1021, had a bunch of new requirements for condos. The only one that really specifically affected the SIRS requirements is this reporting process. So initially, there was a need to file a statement to the Florida Division of Condos, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes, saying, "Hey, we've done our SIRS." Now they have since created a website for doing that. So there's a very nice, easy to use website. You can go on there. So kind of an online questionnaire. You indicate that you've had it done, and you're good. That's basically it. Second thing you have to do, though, is also to make that study available to the members of your property, either distributing copies or making notice that is available for copying. And both of those need to be done within 45 days of receiving that. So if you did a SIRS in the last year or two and never reported it, please do that. The state is very anxious to know how many buildings have done this, which I'll talk about in a little bit, what that kind of picture looks like, but that is a new requirement.
And
And
let me say
please,
something, Will, because this is super important for me. Compliance. Going back to your, it's being transparent with your owners. Owners have the right to have this, study. One of the things that you and I and AKAM have joined forces again is explaining to the membership the numbers, right? Your actual reserve study. One thing is you make it available, but I think it has really, really worked well when we join forces as a team, right? And we go to the communities and explain the reserve study as a whole, like looking at the big picture, why you recommend, that they need to be funding XYZ.
Yeah.
Because again, the statute has always been that you need to make these documents available. Now it's just making sure that you're putting it in the portal of your community. But I think the strategic, again, when you join forces with you as experts, with AKAM and with the board, you make this accessible to your owners. you have to go out there. And I think for us, it's very important that that type of conversation, having the facts, showing exactly, the why we arrived to that number. And it's just not a number. It's like there's a reason behind the study. So I think we have done very well in being ensuring that we are, one, in compliance with the statute, but two, is informing the ownership, right? What they have the right to have.
Yeah, and I think that's critical to get their buy-in and their acceptance and their participation in this reality, right? This is not something that the board should hide and keep to themselves and stick in a drawer, and just send out a budget notice and not provide people with that information of how they got to those numbers.
And I just wanted to add, we have seen this in working with new communities and in places, to board members on the phone, on the call, you have to disclose the entire report. You cannot just put a summary without the photos, without the documentation of the dollars, or the reserve specialist, or the author's entire appendices. So just for everyone's knowledge, we've seen this in a couple places. You must show the entire report.
Yeah, absolutely. So this slide that we have up now is kind of talking about the enforcement of Senate Bill 154. There's been a lot of discussion this spring in particular about this question of, well, so what? Well, what if we didn't do it? So I wanted to highlight a couple of things that are in the law now that are very relevant, especially to the board members out there. So this is taken straight from the Senate bill. If you're a board member that has willfully and knowingly failed to complete your SIRS, that failure is a breach of your fiduciary relationship to the owners. So maybe you guys can tell a little bit more about, from your perspective, what that means. But to me, it always means the biggest threat is your directors and officers liability coverage may not protect you from personal responsibility if you're found to be in breach of that fiduciary responsibility. So,
It's specifically that, just for people watching, imagine you taking personal responsibility for willfully to complete the study. You are on the hook, person.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. So, and I should probably point out, none of us are attorneys, so none of this is legal advice. Don't take it that way. But I have heard other people say that a lot hinges on the words willfully and knowingly in that sentence there. For example, like last year, when every reserve study company in Florida was completely maxed out trying to get as many of these done as possible, there probably was a lot of buildings out there that may have tried to get proposals or tried to get it completed by the deadline and couldn't, not for lack of trying, but because there was no provider available. I think that's largely changed now, but that's, if somebody were challenging me that I failed to meet the deadline, and I said, look, here's 10 emails I got from companies saying they couldn't do it, I think you'd have a good argument there, but that's maybe for others to speculate about. This is another one that's interesting. So as of this year, any sales contract for a unit in any of these properties must state that if your association was required to have this done, and if it has not completed it, that has to be disclosed in the sale contract. So that to me is a potential warning sign that could hurt property value in these buildings, right? If it is out of compliance with the law, if I'm a potential buyer and I'm looking to buy into a property, especially an older building, and I see these two facts that, hey, they were supposed to have this done and they didn't, that's going to maybe trigger some alarm bells for me and say, well, why not? So that's more just kind of from a marketing standpoint of your property, just to have all your ducks in a row. That's, obviously we're in a challenging time right now in South Florida, especially for the condo market. The insurance costs are increasing. We've got legislative requirements. It is not a seller's market anymore, let's say. And so everything you can do to make your property more attractive is probably in your best interest. And that would mean getting this work done as well. So yeah, just kind of summarizing this, what if we don't? Well, first of all, again, that deadline is passed. The legislative enforcement, I would say, is coming at this point. It's kind of summarized that in the last couple of slides. I think what we're going to see a lot more of is just the private industry going to their own underwriting standards and saying, well, if you have not gotten your SIRS done or your milestone inspection done, we may not renew your insurance policy, or you may not be able to qualify for loans in this property. So I don't know, have you guys seen that? Have any insurance renewals come, been stopped at that point this year for you?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what actually has triggered them to get the reserve study and everything. Like we gotta get it done, right? Yes, and lending, it's a major factor as well, because they're not just looking at it through okay, why are they going to lend you $20 million or $10 million? So there's so much requirements that if you don't have the basis done, they're not going to give you the money. It's very simple.
Right,
They won't,
exactly. And then my last one here about it just being the right thing to do. Again, you set aside the legislation, right? Let's imagine a world where the tragic, tower collapse never happened, and we don't have any of these new laws. All of the underlying drivers of reserve funding still exist, which is just Mother Nature and Father Time. Properties get old, they deteriorate, things need to be replaced, and you need money to do that. That has always existed and will always exist. So it just makes sense that you should have some kind of financial plan for doing that. I think it's just irresponsible to act as if that's not the reality and that you will just play musical chairs and assume you're not going to be the group of owners who lives in the building when X, Y, and Z take place, right? Unfortunately, the state allowed that by allowing people to waive reserves for a long time, but those days are over. So, it is just fundamentally, the math checks out. It is the right, responsible thing to do to properly, care for your property and make sure that it's going to be protected for the long term.
And I think that one thing that really can't be overlooked here is that there is a thought over asset value, right?
Mhm.
And when you've done the study, when you are planning, you don't have to have it all funded. You don't have to have all the money in the bank, all the things we've talked about. But when you really have followed the rules and you can show to potential buyers or show to the lending community or to the insurance community that your property is doing the right thing, you're already setting yourself apart. And I think that it is a complicated market, especially here in South Florida. Just between the three counties, we have different rules. Inside the counties, we have different rules. So I think that there is just so much glass half full stuff to talk about when
Yeah.
you are doing it that makes your community just much better than your neighbor.
Yeah,
and you're
that's
competing.
Yeah, that's the third point I have on here. There is a positive side to all this, that glass half full. You're absolutely right. The advantage of having a healthy reserve fund is that you will not get hit with special assessments or loans for things that were, unnecessary. You can be spreading the cost of ownership over the entire, age of the property, over all the people who come and go, who will enjoy the use and benefit of all those elements, not just the unlucky group of people who happen to live there when, any given project needs to get done, right? So there is a positive aspect to this, and the fact that the entire state has been, now subject to this new requirement means that every condo is in the same boat, right? It used to be, and I guess there's some subjectivity to this, but I feel like there was almost a penalty paid in the marketplace 5 years ago. If you were a condo building that was trying to be really responsible and fund your reserves accordingly, your dues were higher than the building next door, because the building next door is waiving them and, relying on rolling the dice and passing special assessments. But to a buyer, they're looking at 750 a month here and it's 500 a month here. I want to go pay 500 a month. That's more attractive to me. But they were missing the part where there was no money in the bank and they were going to get hit with a $10,000 special assessment that would have never happened to the people in the building that were funding reserves appropriately. So this is kind of leveling the playing field to me. It's making people pay the true cost of ownership for living in these buildings. And it may take a couple years for that to fully be appreciated and washed into the property value of these places. But I don't know if that people may see that differently, but just from my perspective, I feel like I felt bad for some buildings who were actually following their reserve study, because it meant to the uneducated buyer it felt like they were paying a premium. So
not today. And you're 100% right, Will. And I think that 100% right, Will. And I think that this can't be undervalued. How trying to get to a financial trajectory over a bunch of years, 3, 5, 7,
Mhm.
over sort of typical SIRS useful life stuff and some of your big non-SIRS, that if you can really see how that's going to be funded over the long term, you take a lot of air out of the room, and a lot of this, condo crisis sort of
Yeah,
panic, that we hear. And look, it is that sort of true cost of ownership, and it is really the reality, but it's much more normalized than big spikes where we see every day, now 5 million, 10 million, 20 million special assessments are becoming very normal for
yeah,
years and years of deferred maintenance. So it really does drive, I think, at that asset value discussion.
absolutely. All right. So I guess just to put a pin on this section, look, the sky is not falling. I have some good data that we're going to come up with in a little bit here that's going to hopefully calm some fears here, right? The Florida housing market is very, very strong. It's going to remain desirable. It's a great place to live. It's not like there's going to be some, epic, migration away from the state. Florida is always going to be a great place to live. It's going to be maybe a bit of a bumpy ride here for a year or 2 or 3. I don't know. But at the end of this process, you will have financially healthy buildings that are going to be, set up for the long term, and maintaining that property value that will keep them attractive for future generations.
And it's interesting because again, everyone loves coming to Florida,
Mhm.
right? If you think about it, you come and retire here, or you start businesses here. This is designed, so it's so much beauty on all the condominiums, and all the condominiums are in the same boat in essence. They have to do this. They have to, do the recertifications. There are a few communities that are starting to again the development part of it. But at the end of the day, that property needs to be competitive,
Mhm.
right? So if you're doing all the right things, you are ahead of the curve. If you're not, don't worry, we'll get you there, right? It will, like you said, we'll take some bumps, but you want to join forces with your strategic team to make sure that's accomplished. And I love what you're going to share now because it's like mind blowing on
Yeah,
how condominiums.
yeah, it's so this is interesting. So Florida and California are, neck and neck. Most year it's one or the other has the total amount of community associations in the country per, by state. So it's in Florida, it's roughly 50,000 community associations when you factor in HOAs. But I want to give you just some sense of the size of what's going on here. So in the state of Florida, according to the DBPR, there's just under 25,000 condo associations. I actually believe that number is a little bit higher. I've seen other databases that have it closer to 29 or 30,000, but for the sake of the presentation, let's call it 25,000. Um, Data I found was 712 co-ops, so much smaller number, but they are subject to the same requirements. So we're talking about those here. That's as of earlier this year. Now, if we look at how many of those properties need a SIRS, this is an interesting kind of investigation. So again, according to the DBPR's database, and just to back up a step, in 2022, when we had Senate Bill 4D, that was kind of the first legislative response to the tower collapse, it actually created this database specifically to identify how many condos out there are 3 stories or more. So the condos kind of had to self-report, had to put their hand up and say, yes, we're here. We have buildings that are 3 stories and above. As of earlier this year, the data said it was about 12,000 associations that met that criteria, which to me seems very, very low. I think there's actually quite a bit more than that. This was a voluntary thing, so you have to imagine there's some associations that just never got around to it, didn't know it was required. But let's just say there's 12,000 or so that we know are subject to it, which is about 49% of that total number. Could not find any data about how many co-ops. If anybody out there knows of how many co-ops or 3 or more stories, please shoot me an email. I would love to know, but that's a question mark for me. My greater point is that because this data is self-reported, there's probably some percentage of properties that didn't know or didn't do it. I think it's unreliable. So what I did was I looked at my company database, right? How many properties do we know about in Florida? And of those, how many are 3 stories and above? And in our case, it's about 63%. So close to 2/3, not a half, of condos are taller. They're 3 stories and above. If you take that percentage to be true statewide, then it's probably more like 16,000 condos and co-ops that are 3 stories and above. Okay, so hold that number in your mind for a moment. How many have done it? Okay, so again, we look to the DBPR, to their public database. This was as of February. I think the number is probably now higher, but when I first looked at this in February, again, a month after the deadline, only 4,300 condos and 69 co-ops had reported that they got it done. Okay, so we're still talking about the vast majority of the market that is out of compliance here. Somewhere between a quarter to a third did so, roughly, but I think that there's many thousands of associations out there that were kind of waiting maybe to see what happens, and we're going to find out. But that's what we have found so far. Now these next 2 slides are interesting. So what I put together this was just to kind of give a sense of how the health of Florida associations compares to the rest of the country. So I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but our company is nationwide. We have, offices from coast to coast. We have clients in all 50 states, and we have a lot of data. We've been around since the 80s, and we have this huge collection of data where we measure this metric called percent funded. I'm not going to explain that in detail now, other than to say percent funded is like a credit score or a grade point average. It's a snapshot in time that measures strength. In this case, the strength of a reserve fund. How much money do you have compared to how much money you should have? That's what percent funded represents. So this is national data, and we see here this kind of 0 to 100% scale. And the different color bands here represent how many properties percentage-wise fall in each range. So we consider this, low end, 0 to 30% funded is kind of a weak position to be in. 30 to 70% funded is a medium risk, moderate range. 70% and above is strong. That's where you want to be. So it's kind of a nice bell curve. It's a little heavier weighted towards the weekend, but you see that distribution. There's quite a lot of properties out there that are doing pretty well. Compare that to Florida, and we have a much higher percentage. If you add together these 3 bars, it's about 50% of properties that we've worked with in Florida, as measured by percent funded, fall into this weak category, and relatively few in the strong range. And I think that's entirely attributed to the legislation that we've had and this legal option to waive reserve funding. It absolutely makes sense that these properties, generally speaking, are worse off financially compared to the national averages. So again, there's a lot more I could go into there, but I just wanted to give everybody that kind of pretext for what we'll talk about next. Okay. All right. So this is our last kind of official section, and then we want to go to Q&A. So I see some people started asking questions there. That's great. Feel free to add those in now. But what we're going to do next is just, I'm going to talk, and you guys can comment as I do it, talking about what we've seen, right? So our company has done about 1,000, a little more than 1,000 structural integrity reserve studies to this point. And this is what we found. So the first thing that we did was to look at all those properties we worked with and separate them into 2 categories. First category is those that have been funding their reserves. Okay, so good news is most of the properties that we've worked with were already doing something. And here's what that looked like. So on average, those properties were budgeting about $197 per unit per month into their reserve fund. Now, this is a very wide range of properties. This is old and new, high rises, low rises, coastal, central, very wide kind of cross section of all different types of properties. Some will be much less than that. Some need to contribute more than that. But on average, we're looking at $197 a month. The next thing we wanted to do was figure out what is the bottom line impact of these requirements. So we do our service for them, which is really a joint service. It's a structural integrity reserve study paired with a non-structural integrity reserve study, a conventional study. If we added the bottom line recommendations of those two together, we came up with this average of about $294 per unit per month. That was the new number we recommended for them, which is about a $97 a month increase. Okay. Remember, they were already doing 197, so another 97 bucks a month on average was the bottom line impact that they had to do over and above what they have been. If we wanted to show them, hey, if you do want to continue to waive, or if you want to start waiving reserves for your non-structural components and just focus on the absolute legal bare minimum just to do the structural, they found, or we found, they could actually decrease their overall budget by about 13 bucks per unit per month. Not saying they should. Obviously, we've been saying a lot about the need to fund all of your reserves, but in theory, if they wanted to just do the absolute bare minimum, on average, most properties could save money doing that. Okay. Now, the second category were those that have not been funding their reserves. And this is what we found there. Obviously, they're doing zero now. So anything that we recommend is going to be a net increase. In this case, the combined average net increase, about $331. Makes sense. They're not funding. So anything that they layer in is going to be somewhat painful. And they probably have some catching up to do because they're behind. Similar analysis, if they just wanted to focus on the SIRS components alone, we're talking about a $200 per unit per month increase. So this was the first and most important thing I wanted to find out is, what's happening to the buildings out there when we read these headlines and I hear these interviews saying, we are people on a fixed income, we can't afford this. This is going to bankrupt everybody. We're going to move out and we're going to have to sell the building. The data doesn't support that. That is absolutely true in some cases. I don't want to make light of that or ignore that reality. There are some buildings that are so far behind and have such a huge mountain to climb and really cannot afford to do it. That does happen. That's called condo termination. And that's kind of the death spiral for a condo building, right? You're upside down, your owners cannot afford it, but that is the exception, not the rule. Okay. The next thing we looked at was special assessments, right? That's a fact of life. Unfortunately, in 17 years of doing reserve studies, I can tell you reserve assessments or special assessments have always been an unfortunate reality for a lot of properties. They are just behind. They weren't funding what they thought they needed to do. And so they need a special assessment. They need that shot in the arm in addition to their annual budget to clear a hurdle to get them back on track. So again, splitting into the two categories, those that have reserves, it was about 1/5 of the time, 19% of the time that we recommended a special assessment for their structural components. When you layer in the other components as well, it's about 1/3 of the time that they needed a special assessment. Okay. So another way to say that is 2/3 of the time they didn't. Okay. Now, unfortunately, when they did, the special assessment was just under $10,000 per unit compared to the buildings with no reserves. What we see is not a surprise, a higher frequency of needing special assessments and a higher dollar amount when they were required. Now, what I want to say and try to make this clear about these special assessments is in almost all of these cases, this was not the result of the legislation. It was, again, the underlying Mother Nature, Father Time. It was the fact that these projects have come due. These properties had very little money or no money in reserves. A special assessment was inevitable. It was not going to be avoidable. Whether or not this legislation came around or not, they would have found themselves in this position no matter what. The roof on your building does not care what the government says about it. It gets older every day and it costs what it costs to replace. Okay, so these, special assessments, I would put almost air quotes around special. There's usually nothing special about them. They're just the inevitable conclusion of not having funded reserves enough in the past. Does that make them popular? No, but it's a painful reality. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think also, and I think also just for our audience, that one thing to notice here, sort of the bottom line with reserves and without reserves, the sort of the cost per unit isn't that far away. The percentage of time of when it happened is different, but the dollar values really weren't that far off. And when we looked at this originally, I thought that was really interesting. And again, I think this also goes to what were being used as baseline dollars for some of those reserves that had been done 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I think now when you look at inflationary sort of situations, when you look at the robustness of the reports now, and when you look at the formulaic split out of the required versus non-required, I think again that the report is that blueprint now for costs that are a lot more real and a lot more reasonable. Because oftentimes people would carry, we would see it, 5 years ago, put 200,000 for a roof. Well, but you didn't think about energy code, and you didn't think about your parapet, and you didn't think about your mechanical equipment having to be raised, and all sorts of other code changes and the like. So you know what? A $200,000 roof is $1 million roof. So these are things that really, I think now this studies help to identify those pitfalls. There are much more reasonable real world dollars being carried. So again, those monies going forward hopefully represent a more real life buying reality than just an actuarial exercise in the past.
Yeah, and Alex, I want to add to that too, because it's very interesting. Again, your mind cannot think of 5 years ago, I did a reserve study and that's the amount, right? Absolutely not. I think best practices, and well, I'm going to ask you the question, right? Because we see it all the time. Like, how often should actually a condominium, right, do a reserve study? How often? What's the best practice? I know years ago it was not even required. Now it's required, obviously. So again, when you think about it, short or long term, like what would be the best, recommendation? Because also the community has to budget, in their operating to do this study, right? So XYZ, whatever the cost is, how often it's always like recommended to do a reserve study?
That's actually a perfect segue into the Q&A section, because actually somebody asked that exact question. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to that now. And hopefully you guys are able to see these as well as panelists. Can you see those, the Q&As that people have answered or put in there?
Go ahead, roll through.
Yeah, if not, I'll just kind of read them out loud because the audience can't see them anyway. So I'm just going to start at the top. Actually, you know what? I'll start with that one since it was just asked. How often do you do a reserve study? So legally speaking, the requirement to do the SIRS is at least once every 10 years. Now, I will tell you, and I hope it doesn't sound self-serving, but I think most people would agree, that is way too long to wait between reserve study updates, okay? Reserve planning needs to be incorporated into every single year's budget. So every single year, the board needs to sit down, look at those numbers, and put together a updated schedule of life expectancy and cost, and figure out what it's going to take to fund according to those data points. That doesn't mean you have to hire a professional to do that for you every year. The conventional wisdom is about every 3 years to do a fresh on-site evaluation and to get a kind of a physical checkup done for your building. That is the law in several other states. I mentioned California is probably the best comparison. California, every 3 years, a reserve study is required, including a new on-site inspection. So that's a good rule of thumb. It's not legally required, but I would say certainly in the best interest of the property to make this an ongoing, if not annual, every couple year exercise to course correct, to keep track of projects you've done, changes in the marketplace. I have no idea what's going to happen this year or next year with tariffs, for example. An air conditioner that right now costs $10,000. I don't know what that's going to cost a year from now. So if an association hasn't been keeping up with those types of changes, you might find yourself that you've drifted way off course by the time you look at those numbers again. So that's my answer. I don't know if you guys, from
Yeah, no, and it's good that you mentioned about budgeting, because again, we want to try, although we all know budget is a forecast, you do the best to budget, but again, you have to join forces with your reserve study, with your audit, with your legal team as well, because as you do, again, these projects, right? Like obviously, you budgeted for a special assessment, you have a capital, I don't know, $10 million budget. you reset, like you said, every 2-3 years, because that's normally, depending on the project, but normally how long a project can take. So when you're thinking, long term and short term, I think it's critical that when a board has the duty, right, of being informed, it's not just putting a number there. Oh, I feel like it's only $400,000 that we need to reserve. No, like, you have to join forces with you as experts, right? And us in management, and obviously the attorney and the CPA, to help drive that number, to the best for the community as a whole. Because you want to look healthy, financially as well. And always looking at what's best for the community. So I'm glad it's pretty much, a 2 to 3 year mark that you should be doing this reset.
Yeah, but your point is well taken about the need to, join forces. Sometimes I use the term, I tell a board, you need to put together an all-star team. You need to have
Yep.
a great manager, you need to have a great attorney, you need to have a great CPA, you need to have, a great staff on site, and you need to have a great reserve study company. And when you're getting good advice and good guidance from all of those experts in all those fields, it makes your job a lot easier as a board member, right? So,
And I
that's
think that
very,
what we shouldn't overlook too is that, budget season is going to be a very different thing in Florida in 2025. That's for sure. And I think most associations are going to be faced with that. I think that you need to, just like in the stock market, you wouldn't leave your portfolio alone for 5 years and never look
yeah,
at it, think it's okay and everything's fine. You look at it regularly. You really try to see what's going on and what are trends and where you're going. What am I going to really touch this year? What am I not? Am I going to bet on something? Am I not going to bet on something? These become real world decisions. And again, when you look at the required versus the non-required, and you aggregate those together, as the numbers have shown, you know, small misses are big numbers in HOA fee every month. So
mhm,
these are ways for you to look at that to try and future proof not only the asset, but what you think you're going to be spending with knowledge. As Maureen said, you're not guessing at what it is. You really have plotted it out. So I think that's important. Just
yeah.
to run through the questions, I think we hit the window and door question. So, and we spent a lot of time on that. Yes, leaky windows could significantly affect. That's true. Yes, you do have a right to a report. The reports are required to be in the office. You have the right to it. In terms of the cost of printing you a copy, I'm not sure if the statute allows for you to demand one, but you can get an electronic copy for free, for sure. We the what are the possible financial implications of failing to complete the SIRS? I think we've gone through that. I think the potential downside is every cost goes through the roof and your asset becomes a stranded asset or a difficult asset to sell or fund or use. So I think that gets
Right.
really difficult.
And the
That
legal implications too for the board, right? The breach of fiduciary duty. So there is another one that's coming, which or potentially coming, which is, I was kind of hinted at it a little bit earlier, but
Yeah.
as of today, I mean, this is literally as of today, there was a piece of legislation. It's called House Bill 913, which, and I may not get the terminology exactly correct here, so forgive me, but there was a Senate amendment to the proposed House bill, and that Senate amendment passed the floor of the legislature with a 100% vote today. I believe what happens next is that will go back to the House, and this is really representing the combined joint effort of the House and Senate during this year's legislative session, which in theory will then go on to the governor, possibly to be signed into law within the next couple of weeks. One of the implications of this new piece of legislation, I just read it yesterday afternoon, is that it is expanding the powers of the DBPR to levy civil penalties to associations, possibly up to, I believe it's up to $5,000 for not having completed the SIRS, and removing board members from their positions for the same reason. So that's more of that kind of enforcement spirit that we're seeing this year. Again, that's not to say what might happen in the private markets and the insurance, the lending industries, but There may actually be fines coming now for associations that did not do it. Now, along with that, also in that bill, it did extend the deadline. So they would be giving till the end of 2025 to complete it. So point being, if you have not done your SIRS, now is the time. It's time to do that. Hopefully there won't be fines or possibly even more, painful enforcement coming again in the future. That's always a possibility, but that's not the law now. That's something that may be coming.
Conversation.
I wanted to highlight that for anybody who might be worrying about more financial implications.
No, well,
Oh, sorry, and we'll just, I'm in the interest of time because we're running a bit over, but I did want to ask you, in your opinion, and you follow this every single day, I'm sure, we hear every once in a while a board that will say, "Oh, they're gonna get rid of this. The legislature is gonna get rid of us." Do you have any indication that this is going away?
Zero. No.
Great.
In fact, the opposite. I think that both sides, the House and the Senate, is absolutely committed to this. I mean, I've met with these people. I've heard their stories of walking the scene at Champlain Tower South. It affected people very emotionally, and there's a deep sense of responsibility to not let that happen again. This is not a frivolous item. This is not something that they want to have kicked, down the road. This is a very serious topic for the legislature, and I do not see it going away. The spirit of this year's session was to try to make it a little easier, a little more practical, layering in some other options for associations in terms of recognizing special assessments, loans, lines of credit, that those may be other ways of paying for these things, but the requirement to do the study and to have that knowledge of what is required, I have not heard anybody talk about getting rid of that.
Yeah, well, and I
Will,
love you mentioned that. Yeah, because again, it's the same concept. Now boards need to get board certified in HOA and condominium 718 and 720, and they need to get a board certification to serve, right? So in the past, it was a recommended several years ago, but it's the same mindset. Like where's Florida going? It's like, we're not going backwards. Now those times have passed, and I agree with you. It's just gonna continue. We have to adapt to this new norm and make sure that you're in compliance. So
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot else to the legislation that we haven't touched on at all, which, I mean, maybe you guys can say a little bit about what you're seeing, some of the board education requirements and things, but you're absolutely right. This is kind of to me, it's a maturing process. There's a lot of things that were written in Florida statute way back in the, I don't know, 60s, 70s that never contemplated the world we're in now. And they're really trying to push to bring things current, is how I would say it.
Will, one last question that just got in your studies when you gave pricing for a component. How close did you find that your cost was from the study to reality when they did the rework?
Yeah, it's obviously that's an important question for us to keep track of, because that's how we stay in business, is by being, accurate. So it's not a short answer. The answer is a lot of the time I don't know, because it may not be years before we work with that property again. And so we may not see the results for 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. I like to think that we've been in business for close to 40 years. We've done over 90,000 reserve studies. If we weren't good at our job, if our costs were not close enough to reality, that wouldn't have been the case. The goal of doing a good reserve study, by the way, is we have zero expectation that we're going to be spot on, right? That every dollar amount is going to be accurate, that every life expectancy is going to be accurate, because this is not how the world works. We don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a exact prediction of how things are going to play out. But what we're striving for and what we want our clients to do is to be close enough on, certainly on the big ticket items, so that they do not suffer any unnecessary loans or special assessments, right? Everything we look at in a reserve study or in a SIRS is fairly routine and predictable. The scope of work, the costs are things that we can wrap our heads around. If we put together a good plan and they follow that plan, the goal is to avoid unnecessary financial stress, not to thread the needle perfectly. Of course, we want to be as accurate as we can. And a lot of the ways we do that is by looking at the actual prices that our clients pay for things in the marketplace, by talking with vendors. I mean, we do many hundreds. I think last year was over 1,000 reserve studies all across Florida. And on every single one of those jobs, we're accumulating data, putting it into a database, looking at trends of cost per square foot for everything from tile roofs to, planter waterproofing to, elevator modernization. I mean, that's our secret sauce, is just the amount of effort we put into gathering real world market data and then using that data to inform the work that we do. So yeah, it's not a perfect science by any means, but yeah, I think that's the value that we add.
And we agree, and we have again, I think, having worked with you all on many projects, I think that the reports speak for themselves. And again, I think the idea of this blueprint or roadmap that associations can follow with some really great data is super important.
All right.
Awesome. We went 15 minutes over.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I appreciate you guys so much. I mean, yeah, I'll leave you the floor. Any last comments before we wrap it up? Thanks to everybody who stuck with us this whole time.
no, thank you. We appreciate it. You can reach out to myself or Maureen anytime here at AKAM if you are interested in talking. Feel free, and Will, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
No,
Absolutely, thank you. And it's always fun to talk and educate. So I appreciate everyone's time, and Will and Alex, thanks.
no, thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
guys. Yeah, our website, if anybody needs it, is reservestudy.com. You can find everything there. You can request proposals through there. All of our contact information is there. And again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with this recording and copies of the slides. Please feel free to circulate those around and stay tuned. Maybe we'll do another version of this in a month or so when we know the outcome of this legislative session, and maybe we'll have
Absolutely.
more detail to share then. But for now, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.